Hello there, welcome to this special, extra special Sonic Talk. I'm delighted to be able to talk to Thomas Dolby. I've been a fan of his for a long time, ever since Flat Earth days and Aliens Ate My Buick, and of course Golden Age of Wireless before that, plus many other productions. Just a really pivotal figure in my own musical journey. He's also been involved in Silicon Valley, moved there in the early 90s and was kind of involved in 3D audio and VR audio, as well as producing numerous other bands as well. He's now back in the UK. Also, check out his autobiography, The Speed of Sound, which is an awesome book, kind of charting through that. There's so many great moments in that. Do check that. It's also available on audiobook. It's just about to launch a new venture, which is a work of fiction, which is called Prevailing Wind. Anyway, let's get into it. How you doing? Everything all right?
Everything is great, thanks. Yeah.
Are you still in East Anglia? You still have a music studio on the go? Are you still in the nutmeg of consolation?
I am actually, yeah. I mean, it's a bit of a domain of spiders at the moment because I only just got back to England after about 9 months away. But yeah, I mean, studio, I don't really have a studio because it's my laptop and I need a decent, monitoring environment, but that's about it. I don't really have outboard gear. I don't have a lot of hardware synths that I depend on anymore. So my studio is sort of wherever I am.
Interesting. I mean, is there anything you miss about having some of that bespoke technology, machine for a purpose and a purpose for a machine, that kind of thing?
I like the fact that machines with knobs and faders and things, you sort of learn muscle memory. I mean, at the end of the 80s, synths tended to go towards sort of rack-mounted units with little LCD screens, and you had to, work your way through the sub-menus to get to the things you wanted. And the annoying thing about that was that if you haven't been on that machine for a couple of months, you've forgotten all, how to navigate around it. Conversely, I mean, for years I used, a couple of Roland synths that was all knobs and sliders. And then for 25 years, I never touched one. And I did a NAMM show a few years ago. I did a demo for Roland, and they dug up an old Jupiter 4 for me and asked if I could recreate some of my own sounds. My hands went straight to the right knobs without even batting an eyelid after 25 years. And I was able to, recreate the sounds the way I did back then. And so that there's something to be said for hardware. But on the downside, then you have to, I live between two countries and it's not practical to ship things around. Things get damp and stop working. Knobs fall off. The cleaning lady comes in and jogs a dial, and suddenly I've lost my patch. There's when you plug it in, and at first nothing works. There's one of 6 things it could be, and you've got to sort of systematically work your way through it. Why isn't the left channel working? Well, I'll swap this. All of that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
I don't miss at all. And of course, software has its own issues as well. But I do find it very convenient that I can flip open my laptop, do a bit of work on something, hit save and close it, and it's going to come back up the way I left it.
It's really interesting. I've spoken to quite a lot of people who are sort of known for their use of synthesizers and kind of hardware, these sort of golden years of technology. And yet most of them now are like in the box. It's like, I can't be bothered with all of that. It's too much friction, even though it's lovely. It's lovely to be reunited with them. The actual sort of reality of working with them on a professional level to suit your own schedule actually is quite a difficult thing.
Yeah. I mean, there are also musicians who have their studio with all of their precious gear in there, and what's inspiring for them is to go in there and switch everything, like a Trent Reznor or somebody like that, where it's like a source of inspiration for him to fire up something he hasn't used for a couple of years and do something new with it.
I suppose that was that led me on to another question, because famously, your sort of synthesis or your synthesizer journey started out when you found, was it a Powertran in a skip outside the Putney EMS headquarters? I mean, for many people, that's the sort of the golden egg, isn't it? It's the kind of sort of, in a dumpster or at a car boot sale, I found X, Y, or Z. That sounds like a bit of a pivotal moment for you. What did that enable for you?
Well, I mean, the thing is, synths were so rarefied in those days. I mean, I used to take the bus into the West End from Wandsworth and go to the music shops that would have a mini Moog or something like that, and I'd play around on them until they kicked me out. And that was about as close as I got to a synth, for a couple of years. And so when I finally had something of my own that was able to make noise, then that was definitely a breakthrough. And and that was coupled to, my first reel-to-reel. I had this Revox that sort of like a traveling Revox. It had a lid on it. And of course, on a Revox, you could ping pong back and forth between the left and right channels and sort of build things up. So I had a Dr. Rhythm drum machine, and it was a Transcendent 2000 power tram. But and you get creative with it. And for a newbie starting out to have limited tools like that and be forced to be creative with them is priceless, really. And it's hard to explain that to somebody of that age today who could download free demos of everything under the sun and get hands on almost everything in the world. And so unlimited resources. But the problem is that, you come up with something cool and you can guarantee there's 10,000 other guys somewhere in the world that have come up with that exact combination. So it doesn't have this sort of rarefied air that we were in back then.
That's an interesting point. I mean, I think even now you look at some of the emerging artists or some of the artists that like Tame Impala, people like that, who've got very specific tool sets and they just sit there and they work with them. And we were talking on the Sonic Talk podcast this week about Air, Moon Safari, very limited set of tools and instruments and microphones, and just worked with that and let the musicality come through. I mean, your musicality, it was interesting because, I mean, throughout the book, I've just been, like I say, rereading Speed of Sound, and, some of the situations you're in just sort of blow my mind. They remind me of this thought of anxiety dreams I have where I'm on stage. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. I haven't got any trousers on and I don't know the song. I don't know the instrument. Let's go. But it doesn't seem to bother you. Yet you're not classically trained. How did you how do you think that works for you? Are you just able to learn quickly?
I mean, I am bothered by it. I think I'm in some ways more motivated by the fear of sort of falling, tripping up and looking like an absolute tit than I am by the sort of glittering prizes of the standing ovation at the end. I have those anxiety dreams as well. And my wife, I'll tell my wife in the morning and she says, "Oh, I'd hate to be you." And I go, "No, it's good. I get them out in dreams so I don't have to live them in real life." So, I mean, not being classically trained, I don't think was an issue for me, in terms of creativity, because I didn't know the rules. And I was working in an area where there were relatively few people working. So almost anything you did, sort of, you felt like a pioneer. But in terms of musicality, I'm a little bit sort of oblique, I guess. A lot of the world, I've sort of, as I teach music, I'm understanding it a bit better. But I mean, I think a lot of the world are very happy with sort of fairly straightforward triadic music, right? Without too many accidentals, without too many surprises. The other end of the scale, you have people who are fanatics for, avant-garde jazz or sort of 20th century, classical music, which is extremely, angular and sometimes atonal and enharmonic. And I'm sort of somewhere in the middle. I like to hear somewhat ambiguous sounds and harmonies that are challenging, but not too challenging. And at the end of the day, I think the message is hopefully quite coherent, but it's not a happy ending with sort of perfect cadences like, a lot of music from Mozart to country to mariachi to, straightforward Eurovision pop music sort of sounds to me like somebody saying 2 and 2 equals 4, 2 and 2 equals 4, 2 and 2 equals 4, 2 and 2 equals 4. So it's like certain music is constantly reassuring you that everything's going to be okay.
It's interesting. It's like the Hollywood happy ending. You've got to have that, otherwise everybody feels ripped off. Yeah. It's like, oh no, I can't handle unexpected stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
or if we're going to do sad and melancholy, let's play Greensleeves, and that's so this is sad, this is happy, a little bit like old theatre where actors in the 16th century had like 5 expressions they were allowed to do, coupled to a hand movement, that expressed all of human emotion. And in fact, human emotion is much more nuanced than that, So, but I sometimes question that, and I sometimes wonder, okay, am I in this sort of quite sparsely populated middle ground between the really happy, conclusive, reassuring music and the really, very challenging, out there music? And so if I come up with a chord change or something like that works for me and really hits me there, I sometimes worry that it's not going to translate. It's not going to communicate to enough people in the world. But I mean, miraculously it does. And when I talk to people, at my shows, or people that, admirers of my music, it actually turns out that chord change gave them the same feeling in their gut, as it did me the day that I committed that I came up with it. So it's not a huge audience and it's not a mainstream audience, but it is an audience that are on my wavelength. And I think that's very important.
Well, thematic emotiveness and any kind of emotive stuff that you get out of music is a bonus, I think. And it's what seems to differentiate between, the slop and the stuff that kind of connects with people. I can't get when I finished in the audiobook version of Speed of Sound, you finish, it's quite sort of poignant, the journey's been like kind of, oh crikey, that sounds like you right through the rinser, and then you hit us with Oceana and I wept like a baby. It was just and because the chords are fantastic, but the 2 vocals, I mean, just amazing. And Eddie Reader is she's like an angel. I can't believe I don't listen to more of her voice. When they did that vocal take, you must have been just thinking, oh my God, was it more than you expected, or was it about what you thought you were going to get? Because it's beautiful.
It was close to what I expected. I mean, I'd worked with her before. I'd worked on her stuff. I'd played live with her, and she sang on an earlier song of mine called Cruel. So I had a very clear idea of how that part would sound for her, but obviously she's in a different register from me. I didn't know how she'd cope with that, and how much of her own little sort of nuances she'd put in. And also her accent, her singing accent is quite strong. It doesn't necessarily sound Scottish, but it's definitely quite strong the way she pronounces certain things. So I mean, I was delighted, with that. I did have a fairly clear idea of how it's going to work.
That's, I guess, coming back to kind of production and sort of the early days. I mean, obviously the technology was not there to allow for, okay, we'll fix it in the mix, or that'll do as a placeholder, those sort of things. So do you think that back then you worked sort of work fast and break things in to take the Silicon Valley analogy, or were you very meticulous? Where did the work go in? Was it pre-production or in the studio, or how did you construct those things?
What era are you talking about?
I guess from sort of golden age of wireless, I guess around there, because you wouldn't have had much of the technology. I mean, I think Flat Earth was a different story, but
yeah. So obviously in those days, tape was analog, and so it was finite. You had finite tracks, you had finite ability to keep overdubbing and deleting and overdubbing on a tape before it would run out. So you had to be aware of it, same way as with a camera in those days, you had like 24 shots on your roll, and you had to be a little bit more economical about what you did. And today there's no limit, to how many photos you can take. So you just keep spraying photos and you can pick one out later. And then of course you can fix things digitally in both cases. So, there's a parallel there. But I mean, I think this also, this relates to the rarity of the synths that we had back then as well. That when you have limited resources, you're forced to not only be economical, but also you get creative. When you hit a roadblock and you find a creative way around the roadblock, and that leads to something else that was unexpected. So I think that was, that was definitely the sort of, vibe that I had in those days. I mean, case in point, I talk a little bit in the book about, I was summoned to New York to do a session for Foreigner.
Yeah.
on the Foreigner 4 album. And I show up there with my Micro Moog, which plays one note at a time. And they've got this very lush ballad, sort of, Fender Rhodes and rock band and this great vocal, Waiting for a Girl Like You. They said, can you put like a really lush, dreamy intro on this? And I've got my monophonic Micro Moog. And they left me in the studio all night, and they said I had 7 tracks of the multi-track to play with, and they'd come back in the morning and see what I'd done. And I remembered reading somewhere that 10cc had recorded oohs and ahs
I'm Not
on
in Love, yeah.
successive tracks of a multi-track, and then sort of played them on the faders of the mixing board, sort of like a mellotron, right?
Yeah.
So I thought, well, I can do that with my synth. So we're in B flat minor, and I played sustained long notes, on the Micro Moog in the scale of B flat minor, with a little bit of variation, and then I had 7 tracks and faders to push up and down, and I sort of played combinations of them with the faders, with a bit of tape, repeat, and reverb and stuff like that, and created this sort of rather Eno-esque intro for that song. And I think if I'd walked in there and you'd given me whatever,
turned up with a D50,
yeah, whatever it had been, I probably would have just sort of played a chord sequence, and it wouldn't have been nearly as interesting as it was.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I think because also, I mean, the technological sort of evolutions that your career has spanned, because then fast forward, and I think Fairlight kind of started to figure pretty heavily in Flat Earth, right? But you used it very organically. It's sort of that. I mean, there are obvious places where you're using it, but there are places where I don't think it is obvious. But at the same time, suddenly you've got endless possibilities, and then the discipline comes in rather than the kind of, okay, well, I've got to be creative. I don't have to be as creative. I can think of anything I want and explore it forever. I mean, did you find that a difficult transition in the way you worked, or was it like a kid in a candy shop?
Kid in a candy shop, really. I mean, some technologies are inspiring, and others you inspire the machine, because you come up with a way to use it that the inventors hadn't really thought of. And I mean, you have to remember that the Fairlight was a sampler, but it wasn't, these days you think of a sampler no different from cut and paste, really, where it's an accurate reproduction, like a clone of an original source. You can cut and paste it here, or you can change the pitch, or whatever. A Fairlight has a very distinctive sound to it, which is quite grainy, because of the limited resolution. And it just lent itself well to sort of woody, granular sound. And then Fairlight had another quirk as well, which is that the individual voices of it, if you opened up the chassis of a Fairlight, there's a bunch of circuit boards in there with tiny little, screws in them that control the pitch and the tone and the volume and everything of each individual voice. And if you play a part, like you play an arpeggio that's got 4 notes in it, it will pick the next successive 4 circuit boards to play them, and it can be different every time. So it's like every time you played in a chord or an arpeggio with the Fairlight or a solo, it had marginal differences to it.
So which is not almost analog in a way, right? Which is weird to think of it that way.
Almost analog, a little bit of humanity to it. I don't mean, literally human, but as the editor then, as a producer is, if you're producing a choir, you listen to successive takes of humans singing, and they're all a little bit different because we're flawed, we're not perfect. And then as the producer or the editor, you're the one that curates it and makes the choice. And if you hear something interesting, you can build on that. You can play to the strengths.
So were you making, because I mean, a lot have been made of the Fairlight samples, because of the library that came with it, kind of that built up over time, this canon of work. Was that available to you at the time, or were you making your own samples? Did that interest you more?
I mean, when you bought a Fairlight, it came with a set of floppy disks that had sort of, Orc 2 on it and, Choir 01 and things like that, which you would hear all over the place. But no, I was making my own. And basically my CD collection, was my library, because I'd listen to a CD, whether it was like an old soul record or a classical symphony, and if I'd hear an isolated note or chord, I go, like, ping went off in my head, and I'd like roll it back a little bit and sample it. And so that became my library, really.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And then sound effects records. I had the BBC sound effects record collection on vinyl, and there was this great sound from the Solomon Islands of like a tribal dance line, all stomping their feet in beautiful stereo in the dirt. And I used that on Mulu the Rainforest because it sounded like trees falling over in a forest. So it's just sort of noticing those possibilities and tying them into the vocals. So very often when there's a theme, Mulu the Rainforest is a good idea. I would pick sounds that seemed to fit in with the overall theme. So there was sort of hopefully a cohesion to my songs where the lyrics, the sounds, the production, the musical choices all hung together and created a very vivid sort of picture.
Interesting. So I've noticed there's a theme, there's a sound that is a theme that I keep recurring in your music, particularly after the advent of sampling, and that's the guiro. I'm just wondering, what was it about that made you? It's sort of almost a signature sound of yours. I mean, it's perhaps not the one that many people would have picked as a Thomas Dolby signature sound, but I keep hearing that, and that's it can be so flexible. What was it that? Where did that come from?
I think naturally with samplers, you play things out of their normal pitch, and they turn into something different, And I mean, in the percussion section of the library was a guiro, which just sounds like,
yeah.
But if you slow that really down, suddenly it sounds like some weird sort of Amazonian reptile, and it just it's just a sound that I liked. But I mean that's an example as well, of using those sort of organic sounds to highlight things that are in the lyrics. On Dissidents, I had an old typewriter that I sampled, and I used the carriage and the keys and so on that. It made sense for the Dissident sound, and creating, like on the Jupiter 4, there's a portamento setting where it plays 4 notes at a time, but if you play a low chord and then a high chord, the individual oscillators sort of bend up from one note to the next at sort of different rates, like sort of non-linear, blend between a low chord and a high chord. And I use that for a siren sound at the beginning of Dissidents, because I'm sort of picturing like this dystopian future, where there's a curfew, when it gets dark and everybody goes underground and they hop on their typewriters.
Was that your first polysynth, the Jupiter 4?
It was.
Funnily enough, mine too. Actually, I bought a second-hand one.
Oh, right.
It was like,
yeah,
and the memories and whatnot. I kind of miss it, although I do remember it being an absolute swine to tune, because I gigged mine, and it was very hard to be sure whether it would work.
I noticed when Roland had me revive it that they don't, after a couple of decades, they're even more unstable than they were originally. But Amy, you can probably, as you remember, you have 8 user presets on that. And I remember the deliberation and the agony that I went through deciding which of my 8 I could sacrifice for this new sound I'd created.
Yeah, well, there's always that, isn't it? I suppose that brings us back to the sort of technology again. Is like that there are kind of key touch points of certainly music technology. Are there any that stand out to you that are specifically enabling for the way that you've been able to work?
I suppose, going from doing my sequencing in the Fairlight, which had its own quirks, page R, to getting my first Mac that would do MIDI. That was quite a big one. I suppose the next milestone really was when Vision, or Studio Vision as it was then, went from being just merely a MIDI sequencer to being able to record audio alongside MIDI, and then the ability to manipulate audio in there. But I mean, what was significant about that to me was that at that point I was living in California. I was friends with the people at Opcode and DigiDesign and those companies in Silicon Valley, and I was sort of consulting with them. So they would give me beta versions of their next revision, and I would play with it and go, yeah, this is great, but what if? and I'd send them a list of recommendations. And if I was lucky, by the time the actual product came out, they'd incorporated my suggestions. So that was what really got me into software and actually got me to move to Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
I caught the bug of realizing that, a new software revision is not something that is a gift from God. It's created by a bunch of guys, sitting in a lab somewhere that may not be musicians and may actually be open to suggestions. And that I, as a musician, as an artist, have the ability to influence the future of technology and the direction that it goes in. And that was a big breakthrough as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. Absolutely. I mean, but being on the cutting edge of technology is often fraught with dangers. I mean, there must have been one or two hairy moments or disasters live that you had to kind of like wing your way through. Is there anything that springs to mind? I don't want to bring back the trauma.
No, I mean, it's like, I try and suppress those moments, but then a fan will write to me and say, I was in Sheffield the night that your light broke down and you couldn't do the gig. So there's been a few like that, but I mean, relatively few overall. And I think, over the years, things get more easily replaceable and duplicatable. So at this point, when I go out, I have, two of everything. I have an A/B system that will switch over automatically. If one laptop goes down, it seamlessly switches over to the other, and things like that. And then also, you're using a cable that if it is lost or damaged, you can nip next door to the chemist and pick up a replacement on a Sunday afternoon. The downside is that that little USB cable was sort of made in China for 98 cents. And the connections are not very good, and you realize that your entire show is dependent on this little tiny USB plug, and that can be quite anxiety making as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's another thing. I mean, the sense that I get through the book. I mean, it's for anybody who hasn't read Speed of Sound, I absolutely heartily recommend it. It's like it's a journey through all of the key moments of the last, technological moments, music. I mean, your opening paragraph where you're trying to send a modem digital thing to Michael Jackson because he was interested in some of your tunes is just sort of a beautiful example of that. But all the way through, I mean, what seems to be driving you, I don't get a sense that you're sitting in front of Eddie Van Halen or you're with Mutt Lange and you're going, oh my God, imposter syndrome, all of the doubts that many of us sort of suffer. I mean, you do mention about once, I think you're playing at Radio City, at your first US gig, and you just got stage fright and you didn't really know how to deal with it. But apart from that, the rest of it, you seem supremely kind of able to deal with these kind of massive situations, looking back on them. Do you think that they were portentous then, or did you just kind of deal with things as they came?
Yeah, I mean that's there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, I suppose so. Big question.
I'm not a trained musician, and I'm not a virtuoso at anything. There's moments when that's the way that musicians sort of relate to each other. I mean, I remember when I first showed up in New York to play with Foreigner. Mick Jones had his roadies set up a keyboard and a guitar amp out in the studio so we could jam. And, I don't really jam. I mean, that's not what I do. Right. I don't, even 12-bar blues, my brain is a couple of bars ahead of my fingers. I could go back later and do a great solo, but in the moment, not at all.
Right.
And so that wasn't how we connected. But I mean, I think that the people that I work successfully with sort of got me and got what I am and I'm not. And I'm very stimulated by somebody who is brilliant in their own field, and I can sort of collaborate and interact with them, but stay in my lane. And I think that's a really important quality to have. So it was really flattering when somebody like Mutt Lange or Eddie Van Halen or whatever, appeared to get me, that there's just a sort of intuitive sort of interface that you just get from hearing each other's music. I mean, there were times when I've had a lot of interesting guest musicians on my albums. And in my mind, when I invited them in my mind, I would hear them being themselves on my record. So, I mean, an example was I got to play with Jerry Garcia and Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead.
Yeah.
And when I was 15, I was a Grateful Dead fan, and I saw them at, I don't know, Nebworth and Alexander Palace, or those sorts of places, and really liked their music. And years later, when I was living in California, I had a connection, got the opportunity to play with Jerry and Bob Weir. And in my mind, I had this song, and I could imagine them sounding exactly like themselves on the outro to my song, Beauty of a Dream. And I got there to this sort of warehouse in Marin County that was packed high with their PA stuff. And they came in and they tried really, really hard to sound like Thomas Dolby.
It was the wrong way around, right?
And it was the wrong. No, that's not. No, just be yourselves. And it was interesting because Bob Weir sort of got that and figured it out. Jerry is late in his life, as towards the end, and bless him. I mean, it was kind of like you'd reanimated his cadaver and connected electrodes to his fingers, and they sort of remembered some of the riffs that he used to play, and he played a few, and I managed to string them together and make a solo. But it was really, I mean, he's amazing, but it was late in the day to be working with Jerry Garcia.
Yeah, I guess so. So are you one of those people that is a meticulous tweaker? Are you kind of like nudging hi-hats and finessing envelopes and automations late into the night, or do you try and splurge creatively and then have a different process and work fast? How do you like to work?
Well, when I'm with other musicians, I think there's a sort of there's a magic hour approach. I mean, there's a sort of a preload moment when you're connecting, chit-chatting, giving anecdotes. You get hungry, you order in some Indian food, and the studio is ready with the cans mix and with the tape and mics and everything. And at that point the magic hour commences, and an hour or two from now the window will have closed again.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And that's what is so special about working with musicians is that you have this finite resource of the moment when everything is clicking in the studio. Well, the studio is transparent at that point. It's just a meeting of musical minds, but it won't last forever. And so during that time, you've got to capture the raw materials with which you then go home, and you can spend hours or days sifting through what you did and using these sort of big chunks of brilliance as building blocks. But yeah, I'll hack them to pieces. I'll unpack them, dismantle them, reassemble them, and I'm very meticulous like that.
And is that something that you still do yourself? I mean, because many people have a studio assistant or a person who runs the DAW or whatever it may be, or are you very much like you want to be in there with the nuts and bolts?
I'd love to have that. I mean, actually, I'm working on a new project, which is an orchestral project. And actually, one of my students from Peabody is assisting me and sort of doing a lot of the left brain stuff, which is a real luxury, actually, because I've never really had that in the past. I've always done everything myself. But yeah, I think it's important, actually. I mean, because we have so much power, so many different tools that are at our fingertips. A single brain can't really cope with all of that power and responsibility and still be free and to play like a kid. So I think it's great to have an assistant that you can offload that stuff onto. And it's also important because the knowledge has to be passed on, and that's not something they're going to get from YouTube tutorials or from reading the manual. They need to get that from the wisdom and experience being passed down, from one generation to the next. So I think that's a really important process. And my students at Peabody, they have to do an internship in their third summer and go out and get an assistant job for somebody working in the field. And that's a crucial part of their degree.
Yeah, hard, I'd imagine, as well at the moment. I mean, the sort of limited, the opportunities are sort of shrinking or different, I suppose, than how they were with so few commercial studios. But I guess there are lots of people with home studios that maybe, they want to, they could do with some help in as well.
Yeah, it's less about the recording studios. It's more about the people.
Being around creatives,
I think that there are actually more paid professionals working in the field now than there ever have been. And I think especially with film and TV music, what with prestige TV, Netflix, Apple TV, etc., and games, that there's a lot of people working week to week in that area. I mean, it's a bit of a lull at the moment post COVID and everything, but in general, it's been up and to the right, and those composers are expected to come up with snappy orchestral arrangements, overnight, and then the director comes in and goes, "Oh, what about if you did this with an African drum section? Just push a few of those buttons on that machine of yours. I'm going to go make a phone call." They assume that it's really easy.
Oh man!
And in reality, maybe a musician can do that, but you've also got to back up your hard drives and name your files correctly and make sure the stems are accurate and hit deadlines. And there's all of this left brain stuff that you really need somebody to be focused on.
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. I suppose this brings me to another question, which was kind of given. I mean, the point you've been through sort of almost the demise of the record industry. Famously, your your US tour that was kind of kiboshed by the whole payola scenario, which is again a fantastic chapter in the book, but must have been awful. I mean, how have you managed to sort of maintain enthusiasm for creativity? Because all of these industries have their own versions of those kind of situations. The just the unfairness and the inequity and stuff. I mean, how do you manage to kind of maintain your trajectory through all of that horrible stuff?
I guess I'm a traveler through all of that. I just sort of, when things get toxic, I just move on to something else that appeals to me. And I keep my enthusiasm because I'm constantly drawn to things that I suck at. I'm sort of, I've always been an autodidact, really. So it's like if there's something that intrigues me, but I don't understand it yet, I love the first forays into it, and the surprises that I get, the disappointments I get, and the discoveries and breakthroughs that I make. And so becoming an expert in a new field is what really drives me, and then gives me a new realm of expression, really. And I'm constantly looking for the upside of things that people moan about. I mean, AI is a good example. Everybody's very paranoid about that, and probably not without reason. But there's also enormous creative possibilities with AI that I find very exciting.
Is that something that you're kind of thinking about at the moment? I mean, what are you teaching yourself about at the moment? What technology is it that so excites you?
Yes, I mean, I'm messing around with AI because this is like the desire to have an assistant. That there are various repetitive tasks that I do over and over again, do the same dozen or 20 or 100 things that I've done, many times before. And I kind of wish that somebody was looking over my shoulder, learning how I did it, so that in future they could do that for me and I could just jump to the next, I could sort of level up to the next point, which is, right, where do we go from here? So, I mean, I love the idea that, the elements of electronic music, which have no knowledge of each other, there's no teamwork between different synths. They each do as they're told, hopefully, and you build things, but you add a new sound and it has no knowledge of the first one. If I bring in a ukulele player and a flautist, then they interact in real time and they're listening to each other and they're resonating with each other. Whereas machines, you open up a new track, open up a new sound, new plugin, and it has no knowledge of the previous one. So it'll just do as it's told. But AI deep learning has the capability of moving beyond that to a point where there is a flow and a logic to, the sequence with which you do things. And I think that's an interesting way forward, that we can go with AI and deep learning and so on. And it's not going to make the headlines the way, robots taking over the world and wiping us out is obviously a continually more sensationalist headline than the creative possibilities.
Yeah, that's true. Well, we've moved from the 80s where it was everything was about sex and salaciousness. Now all our headlines are fear based. Seems to be what sells. Fear sells. Sex used to sell. Sex doesn't sell so much anymore. You're you're just about to launch a new book as well, which is fascinating. So you've yet another sort of string. I mean, I know you've done your autobiography, but this is a complete fictional work, which is kind of an interesting thing. How do you find that process? How does that, in parallel to music, how does it sort of compare to the creative process of that writing?
There are a lot of parallels, but the language and the technique is something brand new to me. When I did my memoir, The Speed of Sound, I was telling stories that I'd probably told many times verbally. Um, and so it was almost like just dictating them and getting them down in words. Writing fiction is a whole other thing because it's sort of fantasy from the outset. And I think that probably, writing fiction is third or fourth on my list of sort of most natural skills.
Right.
I think probably I have more inclination to be a filmmaker than to be a novelist. So I think that when I'm writing fiction, I'm sort of seeing it like a filmmaker. I'm describing it like a director, sort of describing, here's the way we set the camera, here's the lighting, here's the atmosphere, here's the sounds, the smells, and sort of putting that into words. But the fascinating thing for me, well, the challenge so it's a book about sailing classic sailboats, the America's Cup in 1913, and the politics of the billionaires that owned the yachts versus the working men that they hired to sail them, just prior to the World War One. In fact, the America's Cup in 1913 never happened because World War One broke out instead. So it's sort of a fantasy imagination of what happens when a couple of billionaires who are all ready to go with their giant yacht toys are suddenly thwarted and unable to race them because of World War One. So they sort of have a private wager on a race anyway. That's kind of the basis for the book. But seen through the eyes of these poor Maine lobster men who are hired to be the crew on the boat. So, all right. So the challenge really there for me was I understand boats and sailing and racing, and most people, the average person, doesn't really know why one end is pointed and one is rounded, or why they have to zigzag.
You've got insider knowledge, yeah, right.
So the number of people that will understand the technicalities of the boats and the racing and the history is a tiny audience, and obviously I need to reach a wider audience than that. But we mentioned Master and Commander earlier. Patrick O'Brien managed to take that niche understanding, niche knowledge of Nelson's Navy and the way it was run, and turn it into a fascinating, really compelling story by focusing on the personalities, on the thrill, the risk, the magnificence, all of the things that are more universal, not the technique of the book. So that was one challenge. The other challenge was that there's also a sort of thriller mystery aspect to it as well. And I'm not a big fan of that genre. I don't read all of those books from sort of Agatha Christie onwards. I've never been particularly into that. So the craft of how you write a thriller where you need to sort of lay breadcrumbs towards the eventual truth without actually telegraphing it.
That's tricky.
It's like incredibly tricky, and doing it all from a single point of view. So if the protagonist was not in the room when it happened, it didn't really happen. You're not the voice of God who sees everything. You are this one person, and everything's from their point of view. So and everything is a moving part. So it's like if you change one element, you got to then go back and say, well, who knew that then at what point? And
that's really interesting, because I'm sure I've heard, I listen to a lot of podcasts about sort of intelligent machines and kind of and I'm pretty sure that some novelists are using AIs to keep track of their character paths and the sort of what did so and so say at this point. So they effectively, and then they can ask of their own transcript, rather than have to go back and check. They can ask the machine what they wrote about this, that, and the other, and it helps follow those kind of curves. For things like this, it might be an interesting usage of that, or maybe you're already doing it. I don't know. You sound like you might have thought of that.
No, I mean I'm not doing actually, because I wrote the bulk of it. I wrote before ChatGPT or whatever. But no, I mean that's a great idea, because
particularly for episodal, when you've got something that you did 10 years ago. Yeah.
Because I mean, if I'm in the middle of writing a book and I think, okay, I may have screwed some things up here because I just changed this with this, or introduced a new character or whatever, do I now have to go sift back through reread my earlier chapters and correct the mistakes? And when I get up in the morning and think, well, I really ought to do that, rather than writing the next chapter, you know, I don't want to get out of bed at that point. You know,
Yeah.
I don't like doing that stuff. You know, I don't like tidying up after me. I'd rather be out on the fringe, you know, creating the next thing. So you got two choices. You can hire a full-time editor to be doing that and keeping track of it. Or maybe you can have AI do it. And I think that's a great use of AI. I mean, you know, why do we need to feel guilty about using a machine to do some of those times? I know this is all very controversial.
Yeah, no, I think there's a difference between generative and collaborative. You know, they're two very different things. The generative stuff is, you know, it results mainly in slop that people go, oh wow, that's exciting, and then forget about it 10 minutes later. Doesn't matter.
Right.
Bringing it back to, are there any of your classic instruments that you keep around the place that you've still got, or are you the sort of person that just gets rid of everything and keeps everything sort of stripped down?
No, I mean, I've still got a few, not very many. I've got a Moog Voyager here. I've got a Nord lead here. You know, I like the wood pitch bend and the stone mod wheel on that, and the way the LEDs light up. I've got a Virus Polar, just because it's sort of better at those, you know, extreme saw wave sounds than anything else. I mean, I've got a few knocking around. Actually, one of my favorite, you know, instruments that I've had for, I don't know, 30 years is a Yamaha CP70 piano, which is not plugged in. I don't know if I've even got the power supply still, but here's what I like about it. Anytime I walk past it, I can plonk down a couple of chords on it and it'll just sound. I don't have to worry about whether it's plugged in, whether it's backed up. And it's quiet. So it's not like having a grand piano where if the kids are asleep in the other room, I'm going to wake them up. I can just quietly play some piano chords just for my own edification. So it's a great writing tool for me. And I really need to know as I go about my day that if I'm hearing something in my head, I can just sit down and play it without needing to, you know, patch stuff in.
Power up and do all that. And what about in the box? Are there sound sources that you go for? I mean, in terms of synthesizers and that sort of, I mean, I'm not looking for endorsements or anything. I'm just curious where you gravitate towards when you're sat in front of the computer and you're thinking, right, I need a synth sound. Where do you start with that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I've gotten a lot of mileage out of the Logic sounds over the years.
Still stand up, don't they? Still stand up, yeah.
They still stand up really well, and you know, often that they're a placeholder, and if I need something more interesting and more original at the end of the day, I'll just use something as a placeholder, and then I'll go investigate. You know, it's like, okay, this is kind of grainy, so let me investigate some granular synths that are out there, and I'll ask my students what are the hot plugins at any point in time.
So what's next for you? I mean, what musically, you say you're working on orchestral projects. Is music still a big part of your life, the creative part of it, or are you sort of, you tend to kind of meander away from that and exploring other areas more of the time?
I've been teaching for 10 years now, and teaching is quite immersive and quite demanding. So I don't find myself, you know, at the end of a week of lecturing and grading and preparation for the next lecture, I don't really think, oh, I've got a couple of hours free, I'll try and work on a new song. You know, I don't tend to have time for that. But I do. So, I mean, I'd like to get back to it. You know, to be perfectly frank, I'm not hearing a sort of sucking sound for the next album. I think it'd make a lot of people happy if I announced that I was working on a new album, but was not the case. I don't know if I will ever do one. Maybe I've got another one in me. Maybe it won't be an album. Maybe it's something completely different. You know, if somebody came along, you know, if Master and Commander 2 was being made and they needed somebody to write some music for it, of course I'd be there. I think the challenge in this day and age is, you know, given that you need to do self-marketing, you need to find original ways to, you know, to promote your stuff in social media or whatever. That's sort of very, it's very exhausting in some ways. I mean, on a map of the floating city, which you mentioned Oceaneer, that came off of, in order to, I put that album out myself without any help from a label or anything like that. I decided to, you know, create a multi-user online game from scratch, to promote it, where you could earn the right to download songs from the album. I came up with this concept of the time capsule, which was like a trailer that I had behind my tour bus when I was on the road, that you could, people queuing up for tickets could hop into it and record a 30-second video for the future. So you create this library of 30-second videos for aliens that would invade the Earth or future species or whatever. So it's like I put a lot of effort into figuring out alternative ways to promote it in order to rise above the noise level.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work, but at the end of the day, that album was a drop in the bucket of 10,000 other albums that came out that week. It's a very different sort of state of affairs, and so I don't really relish the idea, age 66 or whatever I am, of going through that whole process again for the sake of sort of 10 or 12 new songs. But a one-off collaboration could be really exciting. Doing something in a film or a game, a live project could be really exciting. This orchestral thing I'm working on, it's sort of, well, in some ways it summarizes everything we've been talking about. It's like I've been at Peabody Conservatory for 10 years. Every time I walk past a practice room and hear a brilliant, flautist, or, I walk past the theater and I hear the symphony rehearsing a few bars over and over again, I'll go and sit there and listen to what they're doing. When I sit in front of a symphony orchestra, a chamber orchestra, my jaw's hanging open at just those sounds and the way that they interact, and thinking, well, I couldn't program that in a million years. You can kid yourself into thinking, with sample libraries that you can recreate that. But the fact is, like I said, they don't understand. Samples don't listen to each other. It's just all a numbers game. Whereas musicians, right in their fingertips, they're responding in real time to the sound of the open strings, the sound of their neighbors,
the interactivity,
the sound of the timpanis ringing at the back of the room, the piano lid that's open, the sound from under the stage, the echo that's coming from the back of the room. They're, right in the tips of their fingers, they're responding to that instantaneously in microseconds. And when it all works, it's magic, right? So that's a new frontier for me. It's like, because I'm not classically trained, I can't really orchestrate, but I want to have a go, and I want to get good at it and do something hopefully new and different that somebody that is trained, wouldn't have thought of.
Interesting. Well, it sounds like a fascinating possibilities are still opening up. Thomas, thank you so much for talking to us. I appreciate that immensely. I guess that's it. I guess we'll stop it there. I mean, that feels like a good point, and it's about an hour. I don't want to take too much more of your time, but thank you very much.
All right. Yeah, thanks a lot. Good.